Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Welcome back to another episode of Mosin Markings. Today, we're taking a look at a pretty interesting marking, the infamous Izhevsk bow and arrow marking. Now, this is another factory marking of the legendary Izhevsk factory, much like the triangle marking that contained an arrow, which we previously looked at in another video. And if you haven't already looked at that Mosin Markings video, definitely go take a look at that. I'll be posting a link down in the description of this video, and we'll be doing a little bit more of a deep dive into the history of that factory in that one, especially after World War II. But in order to avoid sort of going over the same thing again, we're going to be talking about a little bit more of a different era, less focus on World War II in this video. And one of the reasons for that is because the time frame where this bow and arrow marking was actually used. Now, this marking was, as far as I can tell, came around at least very early, if not originally, when the Izhevsk factory came into existence in the early 1800s. Now, as one of the trends you'll see with Mosin markings, you'll see some trends with the arrow, right? And this goes back to even before the Mosin Nagant. You'll see bow and arrow markings, or just lots of markings in general that just have an arrow in them. For some reason, the Russians really like arrows. You can probably figure out why that is. A lot of history behind that. So that's pretty cool. Now, this marking was used, again, probably from the early 1800s on weapons all the way up until 1928. And that's an important year because that, of course, is when they switched over to that triangle marking, which is what you'll see on, your typical Mosin Nagant 9130 rifle that you might pick up today. This marking can also be found on 9130 rifles, however, because there are these things called X-Dragoons, if you're familiar with those, and those are typically older 9130 rifles that were retrofitted from an earlier style of rear sight, and those will typically bear these that were made before 1928. Now, I mentioned early 1800s. Now, as you can probably imagine, there weren't really Mosins around in the early 1800s. In fact, it was more like flintlock muskets, for instance, and later, of course, percussion muskets that you can actually go... If you can find one of those are incredibly rare to find today, but if you could find one of those, you might be able to find a marking just like this, with a bow and an arrow going through it. Now, you also may have seen this marking if you saw our Legends Never Die two-part episode 1 on the model 1869 Russian Kirka rifle, which at least part of that rifle was produced by the Izhevsk factory around 1870, and we saw this marking on that rifle, which was pretty cool. So this marking in general has a really rich history, both inside and outside of the Mosin Nagant collecting spectrum. But of course, we're focusing on the Mosins as of today. And you might notice the rifle we're looking at now is, of course, a Mosin Nagant, and it, of course, bears our bow and arrow marking, and it was produced in 1909. And if I move this guy a little bit here, we can see this reads in Russian. This reads Izhevsky Oruzheny Zavod. So this actually reads Izhevsk Weapons Factory, and then 1909, and then this little marking here is G in Russian, abbreviation for Gora, which is year, and then of course our serial number, and then our proof commission Imperial Russian crest, as well as the marking that we're talking about today. Now, is this a 9130 rifle? Well, actually, no. If I zoom out a little bit, you'll actually notice this particular rifle, based off of the rear sight, is actually a 1907 carbine. And it's interesting to note, you can actually find this marking on many other parts of Mosin Nagants, regardless of what Mosin it is that we're looking at, if it was produced by the Izhevsk factory. Now, typically, the biggest bow and arrow marking you will see on the barrel shank, as we can see here, but you can find this marking on a lot of other smaller components. Now, on a 1907 carbine, since only the Izhevsk factory actually produced these things, you can actually find them in really small markings, like here on the rear sight, as well as right here. Get my zoom to work. On the rear sight base, see that? A lot of subtle markings. Now, not super relevant to, say, a 9130 rifle, for instance, which you're probably more familiar with, but if we move over here and look at the bolt, we might be able to find a similar marking. Now, that's a Tula marking. We'll talk about the Tula hammer another day. We can actually see a marking there, which from this, that's probably a Tula hammer, but I've seen this C marking before, and this may throw off a couple of people as a red herring, because a lot of times when we see a C marking, that could be referencing potentially, at least some people would say, the Châtellerault factory or the Systrayetsk factory, because C is basically S in the Cyrillic alphabet. But if I go ahead and open the bolt on this guy and flip him over, we can see that, oh, look at that. We actually have our Izhevsk bow and arrow here on the bolt. And a lot of times on these older bolts produced by the Izhevsk factory for the Mosin rifle, you can find all these weird markings here on this side of the bolt handle. Not exactly sure why, but a lot of times you might even see this guy completely worn off here on the right side, but if you still see all these markings here, probably a good indicator that it's an old pre-1928 Izhevsk bolt handle. And one of the other reasons we like the Izhevsk bow and arrow is because when we find this marking on specific parts, it helps us date the parts a little bit better. For instance, remember, we've already done a video on this one, so we can talk about it. See this marking here on the extractor? Let me zoom in a little bit. This is an Izhevsk triangle, so we know this extractor was produced by the Izhevsk factory after 1928, whereas this bolt was produced by the Izhevsk factory before 1928. So pretty cool marking overall. Not a particularly rare marking, as it can be pretty commonly found on 9130 rifles and 9130 rifle parts, but still a really important component, and it's important that we get the word out there as to what exactly this marking is. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video taking a look at this Izhevsk factory bow and arrow marking. If you like more Mosin content like this, please consider subscribing. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.